and doing business, and thereby reducing the cost of doing business in Ghana. Trading in goods is a complex process for any country, aiming to balance the challenges of ensuring security and protection with the need for growth and economic development. Government regards the implementation of the National Single Window project as another quality example of progressive policy making aimed at strengthening and promoting the competitiveness of doing business globally. It complements the PFM reforms and other reforms which I mentioned, like the export growth which we are implementing. These bold economic policies by government should therefore act as a positive forward guidance for investors and clearly demonstrate government's continued efforts to provide an enabling environment for the private sector to do business in a more friendlier environment and to help us consolidate our growth and national development. Mr. Chairman, I wish to thank you for the opportunity, the organizers, and I wish all of you fruitful deliberations. God bless.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister. Moving on, I want Mike Zikwe. Can you kindly put your hands once again as
Chairman, Mr. Speaker, Honorable Ministers, delegates, ladies and gentlemen. I joined the representative of the Controller General of Customs in Nigeria to say that indeed Valentina Meta is synonymous with the National Single Window in Nigeria. And I remember that in July this year, together with my colleague, former Dr. Eugene Weke, who is the president of the National Association of Government Freight Forwarders in Nigeria, we were here at the invitation of GIF, our counterpart in Ghana, JRA, to share knowledge and experience of the National Single Window in Nigeria. I remember also saying that a prophet should be honored in his home, and that Ghana has proved it with Valentina Minton. On the perspective of the freight forwarding customs brokers with the experience we have in Nigeria on single window, there's need for collaboration and cooperation if the single window must succeed. This has to be done between the GRA and the customs brokers and freight forwarders in Ghana. We urge you to do so. And listening to the Minister of Trade, it's a journey, a long journey that has just taken off today. But the fact remains, as the Chinese would say, that a journey of 1,000 kilometers begins with a step. We've taken the step today. From us, the freight forwarders and custom brokers in Nigeria, we congratulate Ghana and we wish you success. Therefore, on behalf of us, all the freight forwarders in Nigeria, once again, congratulations and wish you all the best. Thank you.
Challenge. Mr. Chairman, honorable ministers of state, honorable members of parliament, members of the diplomatic corps, development partners, distinguished guests, friends of the media, ladies and gentlemen. I'm here representing His Excellency, the President of the Republic of Ghana, who is otherwise engaged out of the country. But it is a distinct honor to be invited to deliver the keynote address for the Ghana National Single Window Conference. Mr. Chairman, permit me to use this opportunity to welcome our international dignitaries to Ghana, a beacon of democracy, an interactive investment destination and a country with a welcoming and genuinely hospitable environment. I hope you enjoy your stay in Ghana. Mr. Chairman, this conference has come at a critical time when the global practice whereby customs administrators or administrations outsource core responsibilities through contacts with the government to private companies that conduct pre-shipment inspection or destination inspection activities is now being changed by many customs administrations all over the world. Indeed, Mr. Chairman, it is important to highlight the fact that the discourse on the establishment of a single window has moved on from the national, which is where Ghana is currently, to regional and indeed the international stage. There is considerable impetus in regional and international fora for greater connectivity between countries, regions, and across continents. For instance, the Asian community conceptualized a regional single window project as far back as December 2005, exactly 10 years ago, and subsequently established a protocol for the creation of a regional single window. It is important that Ghana is not left out or left behind in the adoption and implementation of effective customs policy measures which improve operational efficiency and facilitate trade. I want to therefore commend the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Trade and Industry, and the Ghana Revenue Authority, the organizers of this conference, for bringing together all key stakeholders and also inviting such eminent experts to dialogue on a number of issues which are critical to successfully establishing a fully fledged national single window in Ghana. To complement government's current macroeconomic stabilization and growth enhancing efforts, government intends to further improve the business environment by implementing policies such as the creation of the national single window, consistent with government recognition of the private sector as a key building block for continued economic growth and development. Mr. Chairman, the introduction of the single window is therefore a clear and bold statement of intent by government to address some of the challenges of doing business in Ghana, an issue that is of major concern to both government and the private sector. These inefficiencies in doing business are expensive to the economy and increase the cost of goods, which is borne ultimately by both customers or consumers and producers in the economy. The World Bank's 2016 Ease of Doing Business report clearly highlights some of the bottlenecks in trade facilitation in Ghana. For instance, cost to export, which covers the time and cost for obtaining, preparing, and submitting documents during port or border handling, customs clearance, and inspection procedures is about $490 compared to estimates for OECD countries, which is about $160. The time and cost for documentary compliance, including obtaining documents, preparing documents, presenting documents, submitting documents in Ghana is equivalent to about 5 days compared to a sub-Saharan Africa average of 2 days and an OECD average of 4 hours. Mr. Chairman, our commitment to simplify customs and other border procedures for the efficient clearance of goods or import and export, thereby speeding up the movement of goods across borders, reducing significant issues as highlighted above, so that trade transaction will cost less and improve predictability in delivery time. Government will ensure that there is available resources through the Ministry of Finance and provide the executive support and leadership required in the full implementation of the National Single Window. Mr. Chairman, permit me to briefly outline some of the key benefits the country stands to gain following the introduction of the National Single Window in Ghana. These include the provision of a convenient and a one-stop integrated services through multiple channels, the use of ICT to electronically link government agencies that are involved in the trade process, the provision of tangible cost savings for business and the government, the accelerated release of cargo and clearance by means of simplification of trade-related processes and procedures among controlling agencies, the provision of simplified treatment for the trading community through elimination of duplicated processes, the creation of an enabling world-class trade facilitation practice by providing a fully transparent and predictable border environment while ensuring safety and security through a high-performance risk management, the enhancement of transparency and impartial treatment in the fiscal and custom framework, and the significant reduction in corruption by improving methods to counter dishonest practices and reducing discretion. Trading of goods is a complex process for any country aiming to balance the challenges of ensuring security and protection with the need for growth and economic development. The National Single Window will enhance transparency, accountability, and remarkably ease the cost of doing business, while at the same time strengthening revenue collection. Finally, in conclusion, many countries around the world that have embraced the single window concept have witnessed remarkable transformation in their business climate. Good examples in Africa are Mauritius, Nigeria, Mozambique, and Tunisia. In this regard, I want to use this opportunity to thank all the stakeholders, both in the private and public sectors, for embracing this change process and urge them to continue being champions of their positive change. Mr. Chairman, I hereby have the singular honor of officially launching the Ghana National Single Window and wish you all the best in your future deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you. Please give you up those remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right Honorable Speaker, Excellencies, Ministers of State, members of the Diplomatic Corps, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I've just been warned not to give a speech, and I'm wondering why he is asking me not to give a speech. For a moment when the Minister of Finance was delivering a speech, I thought he was reading the budget. And my thinking was confirmed by the fact that the Deputy Speaker of Parliament was also here. So at the point I told the Deputy Speaker of Parliament whether indeed the Minister was reading the budget. I think that it's been a very fruitful discussion, and permit me to just share some few words on some of the lengthy speeches and very interesting speeches that have been given. Indeed, when we went to Nigeria, we were also told that they got the idea from Ghana, and that they visited Ghana to see how best we started something like that. And in fact, the Minister for Transport indicated to me that these policy statements were made long before. But whatever the case is, Nigeria started it in earnest than we did. And considering the fact that there is some symbiotic relationship between Ghana and Nigeria, at any point in time, is the only country that we can learn from and they can learn from us. I remember when we went to Nigeria, I indicated that our relationship have gone beyond Ghana must go, and they have also gone beyond aliens compliance order. That our relationship to a very large extent has to do with what we stand to benefit. The fact that we have socio-economic relationships. You have huge Nigerian communities in Ghana, huge Ghanaian communities in Nigeria. And of course, the two Anglophone countries that are closer, sandwiched by Francophone speaking countries. It is understandable that we share these experiences from them. And he also indicated that what he saw today, that you have ministers of states who are here representing various interests and ministries, that they didn't have that. It wasn't only that when we went to Nigeria, there was also a concern, the fact that my team was made up of members of various agencies, that in Nigeria they didn't have that. Now I remember when we met the freight forwarders, they said, you are coming here with Standard Authority, with Food and Drugs Authority. Nigeria, we each have taken some transigent position that this is for these people and we must not. One very important aspect of it, in all the speeches that have been given, has to do with the fact that this is a process, it's not an event. And we should be mindful of that. We should also be mindful of the banana peels, that you may trample upon them. I hope and pray that we don't encounter what others encountered. Another very important aspect, which was climaxed by the speaker's speech, that it will help to reduce corruption, because it will help to reduce the human interface. And once that is done, of course, ANAS may not have jobs to do at the ports. And I think that it also help to mobilize the needed revenue. Everything we do, even though the Minister of Finance talked about facilitating trade and ensuring that we help grow this economy, it boils down to one very important thing: how we can generate the needed revenue to provide the basic needs that the people of this country are yearning for. You live in a country where you have over 500,000, 600,000 young people graduating from the universities and various tertiary institutions who are all looking up to government to provide the needed jobs. Of course, it is apparent that government alone cannot do that. And that is why the role of the private sector in ensuring that this single window we have started with the phase one becomes a reality, so that the private sector, which is always seen as the engine for economic growth, would have more to do when it comes to single window. The frustrations that people go through from where I sit at the Ministry of Trade, particularly importers and exporters, is just unacceptable. That people who otherwise would have had their goods cleared in hours would end up spending weeks and months in having them cleared. The focus is not only import, it also has to do with export, and I guess the Minister of Finance talked about that. That we live in a country where you have a balance of trade deficit of $4 billion. The focus is how can we reduce that? And we can only reduce that if we export more and import less. And I think the export-driven strategy that government is having through the Ministry of Finance and other agencies is something that all of us must support. I think that with these few words, I want to take the opportunity to thank everybody for coming, particularly our friends who are coming from Nigeria and other places who are coming outside Ghana. I think I wish you a very fruitful discussion. I will be here. I've been told not to move an inch, even though I have to debate something on trade in Parliament. I've been told not to. It is also refreshing that the compliments given to our sister who was married illegally by Nigeria because they didn't pay the dowry. And if you don't pay dowry, of course, you have to be brought back. She's been brought here. I think government will give her and give customs and other agencies the needed support to see that at least within some few years' time, we would have something to showcase for the global community. That once we implement a single window, and America and other European countries have come to study and learn from us. Thank you. God bless you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Delegates, all too soon, we almost at the end of the day's proceedings. A few more small activities that will take place. We'll have a group photograph downstairs and then come up again for refreshments, and I think that will do for the opening ceremony, which, as we can all see, has been heavily patronized. And in doing so, Mr. Chairman, I want to do some few acknowledgements. First, I think by way of protocol, we want to say a big thank you to the first Deputy Speaker of Parliament for his presence and the support and the words of admonition that he's giving. I also want to thank the Chairman for stepping in for the substantive minister and with his experience having taken us through this function. The ministers of state, namely from the Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Food and Agriculture, the Ministry of Road and Transport. I think at this point we got the nomenclatures right. I review. Transport. The Minister for Transport. Way back in the elementary school, we're chewing it just like that. But now, all sorts of nomenclatures, but Madam, apologies, but then a big thank you for making it. They said we should expand the air ministry. It's been whispered in the air and appropriate persons will hear. I also want to thank Madam Minta for her contribution to this function and of course the work that she will have to collaborate with customs and other stakeholders to perform here in Ghana as far as the supply chain is concerned. We have a couple of participants, delegates from local and foreign. At a glance, you can see some former ministers, some past commissioners of Ghana Revenue Authority, and you have the Commissioner General and his team also present. We have from Thailand, the government's university, which is providing consultancy services under the single window project. We have our business partners, such as Ghana Institute of Freight Forwarders, Association of Ghana Industries. In fact, the list is a tall one. If you realize we did not attempt to indicate the number of people who have come. It seems our friends and brothers and sisters from Nigeria have also come very prominent today. Also say a big thank you. So, as I said earlier, it's a big acknowledgement to everybody, including our friends from the media and other technical support staff. Some have had to come all over from Nigeria to provide all these exciting graphics we having today. So at this stage, Mr. Chairman, I think I have the permission to call for the closing prayer. But once more, by way of announcement, immediately we are done, we quickly descend to the base, that is the staircase, that when you get out of your vehicles, that's where we want to take the group photograph, and then climb up to this floor where refreshments has been laid. So at this point, once more, I say a big thank you for making me up. It's time for your closing prayer.
Shall we please be on our feet again as we share the word of prayer to close this meeting? Father, we thank you. We called you in the morning to preside over this conference, and you did just. We want to say thank you. We bless you. Father, we thank you for all the information and the activities that have went this morning. And we pray in the mighty name of our Lord Jesus, Father, as we live here, you will take us to our respective homes and our offices safely. We give you praise, we give you honor. In the mighty name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, we pray. Amen. Amen.
while we wait for the speaker and the other dignitaries to file through the minutes.
As they are interviewed, you take all those things and then put them in the but you mix it. That's what
What's the meaning? Me pay mo back with Libya. Have you seen him?
no. I mean, that's all you
I'm very happy Papa na sound very friend.
Take these shirts.
On my family.
You see, I'm happy. And people will download that.
Yeah.
No, I was Who will save us now?
Go around though. You want to buy me only view.
Adam.
Adam.
Policymakers sit out without bringing together all the stakeholders.
And also being able to the president's having and achieve the efficiency that is required. So the most expressive extremely important. Change management is extremely important, and empowering the beliefs that one can do is critical to success of any So that comes to the third key that was also the second key, which is the process. IT really was about understanding the process. What is the current status of the system? What are the leakages? What are the areas that bypass the system? What's the reason for them? If you can understand the as-is process, the reasons why it's done, then you can put in measures to improve the to-be and then to automate the so for example, if we talk about corruption, if you say that the operators of the system are corrupt or the leakages, you need to understand, do they have, are they incented in the right way to ensure that they can discharge their duty without pilfering or without having the urge to try and support their lives. So it's a full reform program where you have to ensure that there's a capacity. Also, people are rightly incented and penalized when they go away to ensure that whatever new processes we put in place with automation does actually work to reduce the issues that we identify with the current
What credentials are required to respect discussion on single policy and implementation? I would ask you what are the expectations in terms of marginal increases or decreases in revenue?
So in terms of this reform, we're looking at a number of KPIs, key performance indicators we're going to work with. And one of the speakers talked about the World Bank trading across borders rankings. Back in 2015, Ghana was ranked 120 out of 180 plus countries, where the cost of doing business is measured amongst other indices. So the KPI we've set ourselves is to be 50% in 3 years. So we need to ensure that the time and cost of doing business, not only do we have a qualitative outcome, but also quantitatively we can say that we have reduced the cost of doing business by 50%. And in introducing efficiencies in the system, we can then be assured of increased trade volumes, which will increase revenue collection with the efficiencies that will be introduced in the system.
I've heard banana peels
there will always be banana peels, accidental banana peels, and deliberate banana peels. So with any program of this sort, you have to have a very robust risk management in place. Look at emerging risks, as well as risks that might come up that are not anticipated, ensuring that we mitigate these So a national single window is basically about harmonization of processes across the supply chain. So it's not necessarily the ports. When you talk about the ports is only when the goods have arrived. But before the goods arrive, there would have been a lot of pre-clearance activities. Then you have clearance activities. And then after the goods are cleared, you have the post-clearance activities. So the fixation should not be looking at just the port. Of course, it's very important to ensure that the infrastructure is optimized to fit, to suit or complement any automation aspect that we're working on. But national single window should transcend the ports. Look at the financial aspects, the letters of credit, insurances, payments. Look at the commercial aspect, the relationship between B2B, business to business, the buyers and sellers, where they exchange sales invoices, sales contracts, etc. Then looking at the regulatory aspect, that's the Food and Drug Agency, Standard Authority, Environmental Protection Agency, Customs Clearance. And then finally looking at transport and logistics, the airlines, the shipping lines, the ports itself, the infrastructure, container management. So as you can see, National Single Window, it's not, as was said, it's a journey. And it's about optimizing the entire ecosystem of the international trade supply chain. And that's what we're working for. It's a very ambitious plan, but we must start somewhere and have a roadmap to the vision that we're looking to realize.
How do you do this space? What you are doing is an alternative of you are full
But David, still picture Nivea.
I think you have oh, yeah, look over my
Daddy?
6 countries to date, designing and delivering courses for organizations such as Georgia State University, Nigerian Customs, etc., etc. She is interested in charitable endeavors and holds University of Cambridge certificate in teaching adults. And for the past 15 years, she has also served as a youth mentor, helping young people to gainful employment through career and business skills training. She's passionate about traveling, meeting new people, singing and writing. Of course, you hear her sweet voice very soon. And she's written 4 children books and enjoys using her son as sample audience. I believe you want to take the copyright someday. So, participants, ladies and gentlemen, may I invite Ms. Ngozi to take up the presentation of the first session. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Well, thank you for joining us at the National Single Window Stakeholder Conference. I would like to extend a special thanks to our host, the Government of Ghana, Customs, the Ministry of Finance, and GRA, and most especially to you, our esteemed guests. My name is Ngozi Okafor, as I've been introduced, and I work with West Blue Consulting. I will be acting as moderator for this session. The aim of this plenary session is to introduce the National Single Window. And for that, we have 2 notable speakers. Our first speaker, Mr. Ramford Smith, is a former Deputy Secretary General of the Commonwealth. He is also a former Jamaican ambassador to the World Trade Organization. He will be speaking about trade facilitation agreement that was adopted in 2014 after 10 years of negotiation. As a professional who was personally involved in the process from the first few years, he sees the agreement as relevant to the single window environment and to trade as a whole. Our second speaker, Mr. Tom Butterley, is the former Deputy Director of UNEC. He's the MD of TDAF Consulting, and he is also affectionately known as the father of Single Window. He has worked globally through the UN to support countries in all continents in setting up their single window. Today, he'll be talking about the general framework for the single window, best practices, and institutional arrangements. Each speaker will present for 25 minutes, after which we have a 20-minute question and answer session. Please welcome our first speaker, Mr. Ramford Smith.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator, Honorable Ministers, my fellow presenter, Mr. Tom Butterley. Good day, everyone. It is a great pleasure to be here in Ghana to participate in the National Single Window launch and to see so many stakeholders from the public and private sector here today. The importance that attaches to this event is amply demonstrated by the presence of high-level political leadership from the government of Ghana this morning at the opening, and of course still with us in the afternoon. The President of Ghana and the Ghanaian government must be commended for this singular leadership. I will note that the importance of the National Single Window Initiative is also signaled by the presence of so many stakeholders in the room. This demonstration of commitment by those with an interest in and a role to play in facilitating trade is particularly welcome and reassuring. And I can assure you that you will find that it is one of the fundamentally important aspects of a successful single window. I will begin with a few comments of a general nature on the single window itself. If there's one commonality, it is actually paradoxically that there is actually nothing that's common between all single windows. They are not all the same. And this should not be surprising, for no two countries are actually the same. It is vitally important, therefore, that the development and operation of the single window take full account of the local environment and local capacities and local capabilities, even while adhering to good practice and to international standards. Let me now turn to the subject that I have been asked to speak on, and that is the WTO's Trade Facilitation Agreement. And in doing so, I will address 3 points. Firstly, some of the background to that agreement. Secondly, the key provisions of that agreement. And thirdly, what has been happening since the adoption of the Trade Facilitation Agreement at the Bali Ministerial Meeting in December 2013. And if you're wondering what the Trade Facilitation Agreement in Geneva adopted at the WTO has to do with the single window, it's of course because the single window is an integral and important element of that agreement, but just one element. A good place to start is what and why. The question of what is trade facilitation is not as simple as it appears to be on the face of it. I say this because there are many definitions of trade facilitation. The WTO has not itself defined trade facilitation for at least 2 good reasons. One is the difficulty of agreeing on a formal definition amongst all the members, and there are now 162 members of the WTO. And the second reason, of course, I would suggest is so as to not constrain future discussions, future negotiations on trade facilitation by defining perhaps too narrowly today what trade facilitation actually is. So the definition of trade facilitation in the WTO context must be deduced from the scope of the negotiations that took place on trade facilitation. The organization pursued negotiations to clarify and improve Articles 5, 8, and 10 of GATT 1994, which were adopted in 1947, and that's a long time ago. And this clarification and improvement of these 3 articles, which were adopted 60-odd years ago, was intended to be done with a view to expediting the movement, release, and clearance of goods, including goods in transit. Another important aspect of the scope reflected in WTO negotiations on trade facilitation is the attention paid to technical assistance and capacity building. And that is reflected in what we call special and differential treatment. A third key element of the negotiations were, and this is important in a forum such as this, strengthening customs cooperation, that is cooperation amongst national customs body. So now let me turn from what is trade facilitation to why trade facilitation in the context of the WTO. Many will wonder why there was so much resistance at one point in the WTO to negotiations on trade facilitation. Those countries that for a while resisted entering into negotiations on the subject, and my country was one of those, did so for at least 3 reasons. One was the question of what the scope of negotiations on trade facilitation should be, because of course there are border measures, there are behind the border measures, there is infrastructure that's intimately related to trade facilitation. So one has to have some scope before one can proceed to negotiate. A second reason that some countries resisted starting out on trade negotiations on trade facilitation in the WTO was the fact that the WTO provides for binding dispute settlement procedures. And therefore there is and will be the possibility of legal disputes and indeed even of sanctions within the context of the WTO. And a third reason was because the WTO was embarked on a wider negotiating agenda. And there were concerns, perhaps this was the dominant concern. There was the concern that the balance across all negotiating issues had to be maintained. And therefore there was resistance to proceeding expeditiously on an aspect of those negotiations, which turned out to be trade facilitation, while the others were still in train and had not been brought to maturity. So those were the 3 reasons that I will suggest to you that there was resistance. But the importance of trade facilitation was never in doubt, and is not now in doubt. Especially for developing countries for whom trade constitutes a much greater part of GDP on average than is the case for developed countries. So the WTO embarked on trade negotiations, and the WTO as a forum is unique because there are other organizations that deal with trade. There are other organizations that deal with aspects of trade facilitation, and we know here that the World Customs Organization was also present in the room. But the uniqueness of the WTO in one respect is the fact that it provides for binding legal provisions, but also it provides for a multilateral framework of general applicability. And this is very important in trade facilitation. Trade facilitation in one area will not really work. It has to apply to a number of areas and has to apply to many countries. Therefore, with all countries in the region, for example, establishing single windows, then the synergies and the gains are multiplied. And the WTO provides a framework in which that approach can be pursued. So that is the issue of why the WTO. Now what will this presentation seek to do? I will focus firstly on the main provisions in the Trade Facilitation Agreement, which, as I explained to you, those earlier provisions had stood for 60 years. Perhaps they were now outdated. Then I will speak to the innovations in the Trade Facilitation Agreement on special and differential treatment for developing countries and least developed countries, and those innovations are very important. Finally, I will look at the state of play regarding implementation of the agreement itself, including notification of initial commitments by countries, and of course the acceptance of the protocol, the state of acceptance of the protocol to bring the agreement into force. Let me start with the structure of the Trade Facilitation Agreement, and that agreement comprises 3 sections. The first section, Section 1, responds to the mandate to clarify and improve the 3 aforementioned articles, the articles that are 60-odd years old, Article 5, 8, and 10, which were the existing articles in the WTO context. Those articles were to be clarified and improved. But the Trade Facilitation Agreement does much. The Trade Facilitation Agreement does much more than clarify and improve. It modernizes those 3 articles. Section 2 responds to the mandate to address technical assistance and capacity building. And the Trade Facilitation Agreement approaches what we call S&D in WTO jargon. It approaches S&D in a novel way. it links the provision, it links the assumption of obligations under the agreement to the provision of technical assistance and capacity building in developing countries. And this is not done elsewhere as far as I'm aware. And this is a template that we believe is being laid in the WTO for future approaches to special and differential treatment for developing countries. And Section 3 of the agreement deals with institutional measures, and those are primarily establishment of a committee on trade and development in the WTO, and establishment of national committees on trade facilitation in countries themselves. And I believe Ghana has already established its committee. Now let me look at the first section of the article of the Trade Facilitation Agreement, which deals with transparency and predictability, and there are 5 articles in that section. The first of those articles actually deals with prior publication and consultation. These are amongst the main requirements are prompt publishing of information and documentation relating to the importation and exportation of goods. There's also the requirement to establish inquiry points. There are new obligations which go beyond what existed before in the WTO context. Article 2, for example, deals with prior publication and consultation and calls for consulting traders before introducing new or amended regulations. The subject of Article 3, advanced rulings, is another new obligation at the level of the WTO, although I think, as we're all aware, many countries now, many administrations do in fact implement advanced rulings, but that was not a part of the WTO legal architecture. And that helps, for example, to establish certainty, predictability, and indeed transparency to trading arrangements. Article 10 of the old WTO provision on trade facilitation dealt with the right of appeal. But that right of appeal was not mandatory. Countries were required to maintain or institute as soon as practicable mechanisms or procedures for the prompt review and correction of administrative action relating to custom matters. The new trade facilitation agreement addresses this question of review and appeal in a much more robust manner. In Article 4, the agreement makes the right of appeal definitive. There's an obligation on each member to provide procedures and mechanisms so that any person to whom customs has issued a decision can judicially appeal or otherwise have that decision independently reviewed. The objective is to promote fairness and predictability by protecting individuals and traders from commissions or omissions on the part of customs, which is itself responsible for administering the laws and regulations. Importantly, and this I think is also very relevant here, the Trade Facilitation Agreement also encourages members to extend the right of appeal to administrative decisions from administrative decisions to relevant border agencies other than customs, so that it is a across-the-board requirement that the Trade Facilitation Agreement seeks to implement. Together, these provisions on transparency and predictability are geared towards increasing and reducing arbitrariness at the border. I will now turn to Articles 6 and 12. Those were Articles 1 to 5, which deals with fees and formalities for imports, exports, and transit. And formalities here really covers procedures, fees and procedures for imports, export, and transit. The second cluster of articles, which is Article 6 to 12 on fees and formalities for import and export. In this second cluster, we find Article 6, the first of the articles, imposing a standard requirement. It stipulates that fees and charges should be commensurate to the actual cost of providing services. In other words, fees and charges cannot be disguised forms of taxation or of raising revenue, and in that sense, arbitrary. A new obligation is one that requires members to review these fees periodically. So therefore, the WTO is not only saying that those fees should not be arbitrary, it's imposing an obligation for countries to review those fees periodically. Article 7, which is, I think, at the heart of modernizing the trade facilitation processes. Article 7 introduces the obligation and the best endeavor undertaking to implement measures and procedures relating to matters such as acceptance of electronic payment, pre-arrival processing, which, as we all heard this morning, is part of the Ghanaian framework, post-clearance audits, operation of risk management systems, determination of average release times, expedited shipments, and designation of authorized operators. All these are elements of the trade facilitation agreement to which Ghana will commit. Many of these measures represent current good practice in border management, but were not part of the trade facilitation provisions in the WTO before now, and were not therefore binding obligations. Another new and important provision is the recently agreed Trade Facilitation Agreement is Article 8. This article responds to the negotiated mandate to strengthen customs cooperation. It focuses on border agency cooperation, which is of course important globally, but especially so amongst neighboring countries and amongst members of regional trading arrangements. This new provision urges members to undertake practices such as aligning work days and work periods and establishing one-stop border post controls, some of which, of course, is already under implementation in this region and in the wider African continent. I will quickly mention other relevant provisions of the agreement that relates to the general subject of fees and procedures at the border and in transit. Article 9 is brief. It seeks to address border congestion and increase convenience by requiring members, to the extent possible, to establish inland processing depots. Then there is Article 10. Article 10 is a major step forward in the international community's effort to improve and promote the modernization of trade facilitation. This important article obliges or encourages members to address complex procedures, simplify documentation through measures such as the acceptance of copies and the subject of this conference through the establishment or maintenance of single windows for the submission of documentation and data relating to import, export, or the transit of goods. Once received through a single entry point, the Trade Facilitation Agreement notes the same documentation or data would not normally be requested by other authorities and agencies. Let me say also that the Trade Facilitation Agreement in the WTO requires that members use information technology to the extent. Another important area in which new elements have been introduced into the trade for implementation. If after having notified a date for implementation, you can't meet that date, you can seek some dispensation. There's also category shifting. If you have notified in category B and then you find that you can't implement, you can then perhaps shift to category C. And in category C, technical assistance and capacity building is a condition of being able to implement. So you can seek, of course, technical assistance and capacity building. Least developed countries are afforded even more generous timelines regarding notification and implementation. Now, it should be noted, and this is very important, that as a part of the facilitation of capacity building, donors, developed countries who wish to assist are required to provide to the WTO's Committee on Trade Facilitation detailed information on their assistance programs. That is how they are helping you to meet, because as I indicated, Category C commitments, if you have put a provision in Category C, you are entitled to seek assistance. And both the developing country and the donors will have to report to the WTO on how that process is going. But let me add an important point here. It is that the provisions notified whether in categories A, B, or C will become an integral part of the trade facilitation agreement, making them analogous to legally binding tariff schedules. And I think we all know what those legally binding tariff schedules are. When you have notified a certain tariff level, you can't change it unless you provide compensation and you're legally bound to implement that rate. So that once you have notified these provisions, category A, B, or C, at some point they will all become a legally binding obligation of the country. There is a grace period that will be provided, that is being provided for category A commitments. That's 2 years, and for least developed countries, they'll have a longer grace period for their commitments under categories B and C. But the bottom line is all the commitments will become an integral part of the country's schedule in the WTO. That takes care of Section 2. Section 3, which is institutional arrangements, and that can be done briefly. There are just two major institutional arrangements that are part of the agreement, and one is establishing a committee on trade facilitation, the WTO itself, which is quite logical. The agreement is there, it has to be overseen, and the committee will oversee the documentation, oversee the agreement, and of course, receive all this information on capacity building, on needs, technical assistance provision, extension of times for implementing, etc. And of course, also the requirement to establish at the national level a committee on trade facilitation to facilitate domestic coordination and implementation of the provisions of the agreement, which means at the national level, Trade Facilitation Committee has to be integrally and intimately involved and related to this process of implementing the Trade Facilitation Agreement. Finally, in the final section, state of play, regarding this agreement, which was adopted in Bali in 2013, at least following the negotiations, but is not yet in force. The agreement will come into force when 2/3 of the members of the WTO have ratified the Protocol of Amendment, which covers the agreement, and so far, 2/3 of the WTO membership is 108 countries. So far, 52 countries have ratified the agreement. I think a third, Guyana ratified a couple of days ago. I think Ghana is yet to ratify. From Africa, Mauritius, Botswana, and Nigeria have so far ratified the agreement. Now, in regard to the question of notifying the WTO about when you will implement the provisions, Category A provisions will come into effect when the agreement comes into force. So it is necessary as a matter of some urgency to notify the WTO of what your Category A commitments are. That is those provisions that you undertake to implement when the agreement comes into force. A number of African countries have already done this. The list includes Botswana, Burundi, Congo, Cote d'Ivoire, Egypt, Gabon, Kenya, Mauritius, Nigeria, Senegal, the Seychelles, Tanzania, and Tunisia. Ghana will therefore need to both ratify the agreement and submit its Category A list of commitments that will come into force when the agreement does. Category B and C commitments are subsequent, but Category A is a legal requirement for when the agreement comes into force. You will need to implement them. Some of these countries, African countries, have undertaken quite a substantial list of initial commitments under Category A. However, although a number of developing countries, such as Thailand, Malaysia, Costa Rica, Brazil, have included maintaining or establishing national single windows in their Category A commitments, it appears that so far Senegal is the only African country to do this. This is probably a reflection of what we have heard earlier, that the national single window, it is both a complex undertaking, but it is really a journey and not an event. And I think that many countries would want to have their single windows up and operating for a while before they notify it as a commitment. So it's not likely to be the part of the initial commitment undertakings of many developing countries. And that is the case that we are seeing unfolding in terms of how the national single window is being related to Category A commitments in the WTO. An important issue remains the question of technical assistance and capacity building, and for developing countries, and especially for least developed countries. In July 2014, the WTO announced the establishment of a trade facilitation agreement facility, and this agreement will support least developed countries and developing countries in assessing their implementation needs, and also assist them in identifying potential development partners to meet those needs. So it's a very important facility that Ghana and others will want to take advantage of. And it's also recognized, of course, that many multilateral and regional institutions and bilateral partners, and of course, we know that the World Customs Organization is one of those and is here. The Secretary General is here, so we, of course, welcome him, and we know what an extraordinary role that the World Customs Organization plays in partnering and leading in this area. It has been noted for a while also, it has been noted that the World Bank, for example, has earmarked $7.1 billion for overall trade reforms. And of this, $30 million is being dedicated specifically towards implementation of the trade facilitation agreement.
Mr. Smith, 1 minute.
In concluding, I would reiterate that the high-level political interest and leadership that is being shown in establishing Ghana's national single window augurs well for institutional cooperation and for Ghana's capabilities to meet fully its international obligations. But even more importantly, I think this high-level political leadership and the full House here today as well augurs well for ensuring that Ghana is able to establish successfully the completion of the single window and also advance its competitiveness and by that logic its development. In the final analysis, this is the real importance of trade facilitation generally and of the single window, which is not a standalone mechanism, but has to be embedded in an overall context of facilitatory trade reforms and initiatives. I thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's switched over there. So I will focus on 3 points. What is a single window? Some of the key features, factors for success, the framework, the step-by-step framework. A number of the speakers this morning said this, that it just doesn't, it's not a switch, you switch on single window, poof, we have it. No, it's a process, it's a step-by-step process. And I'll have some concluding comments on that. Yes. So definitions, what is a single window? It was already mentioned by one of the speakers this morning, but it's always good to get back to basics. A single window is a facility. And that word facility is very important. It's not a system, it's a facility. Facility, to make easy, to make easier. That allows parties involved in trade standards. So we're talking about standards. Release, reduce cost compliance, nice for the traders. Reduce corruption, reduction in bureaucratic processes, better collection of government revenues. I'm sure the Ministry of Finance will be happy with this one. Improve trader compliance, risk management, and so on and so on. All of these things which are fundamentally important to the efficient, effective competitiveness of an economy. And the potential economic impact of this, there's a World Bank study indicated that for every day goods are stuck at the border, every day lost is equivalent to a 1% loss in trade. So somebody was mentioning 28 days, 28% loss in trade. What country would voluntarily restrict its trade by 28%? I've worked in trade development, I've worked in policy in many countries, and if we can get a 2, 3, 4% growth in trade, bingo, we're really fantastic, we're really successful. You can get a lot of this growth through just simply reducing the cost, and the 5 to 15% that was already mentioned by the Deputy Minister of Industry. So some of the key success factors, this is from the work that was done in the UN, it's basically surveys of countries, of single windows that have been implemented. Most important thing is strong leadership. Again,